Welcome to Doppelnamers, where we connect the dots between people who share the same name. My name is Elizabeth Russell, and this is the story of my doppelnamer, a pioneer named Elizabeth Russell, who was tried for murder in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in 1892. At the time, it was the most famous murder trial in Wisconsin's history. With me are my good friends Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Neither MJ nor Kath knows anything about the story. They will be meeting the characters and hearing the facts right along with the listeners. Our episode today is called #MeToo. And we'll get to the story in just a moment, but first, we share somebody else's doppelnamer story, and today we meet somebody named Orville Wright.
Okay, sounds familiar.
I know that name, yeah.
Orville John Wright, widely renowned violin maker, was born in 1888 in Eau Claire County, Wisconsin. So he was a toddler at the time of Elizabeth Russell's murder trial. Now, the famous Orville Wright, who made the first human flight, was only 17 years older than Wisconsin Orville, and airplane Orville wasn't yet famous. So this isn't a namesake situation where Wisconsin Orville was named after airplane Orville. They were actually doppelnamers. Here are a few fun facts about Orville Wright from Wisconsin. From early childhood, Orville's inordinate curiosity led him into an almost limitless number of situations, including jumping off a barn with an umbrella.
Yeah. They're connected.
His parents sent him to a singing instructor who told him he was a baritone. Orville would not return for another lesson, thinking there was no future for one whose tone was like a bear.
Oh, that's funny.
So he took up the violin, but wasn't satisfied until he had taken it apart and made some changes. So Orville became a violin maker. During World War II, he did woodwork finishing for the interiors of the B-17 bombers at Boeing Aircraft in Seattle, after which he returned to Eau Claire, where he spent his remaining days among his many friends, with his extensive library and his insatiable desire for knowledge. Orville John Wright. Okay, ready to see what's happening with Elizabeth Russell?
Yes.
Yes.
So, by now, you've met many of the characters in Elizabeth's story. Last time, we got a flavor of what life was like in Eau Claire in the 1890s, thanks to Lois Barland's colorful descriptions. We learned that William Carson, the lumber baron who employed Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Russell, also had a piece of the local banking action. We learned that the sheriff, John Fleming, pocketed money that belonged to the county, and that the highly regarded Dr. Ralph Rollin Chase had no qualms about the idea of pushing an immigrant down a flight of stairs.
Oh, right.
As for immigrants, we learned that Wisconsin tried for a very short time to attract European immigrants, but nativism kicked in pretty quickly, fueling anti-immigrant sentiment right from the start. We met the Jensen family from Germany, John and his wife Maggie, farmers who had 10 kids. Then we met the Eriksson family from Sweden, who were also farmers. That was Petter and his wife Katja, and their kids Edwin, Peter, Adam, Betsy, and Albert, and we learned that Bertha Jensen was dating Adam Eriksson. Now, just before wrapping up last time, we learned that Peter Eriksson worked for Elizabeth Russell on her farm, because remember, Elizabeth's husband Thomas was always away working at the lumber camps. And we learned that Elizabeth put the moves on her young immigrant employee, Peter Eriksson.
Right. And how old do we think Peter was?
Peter was about 22 at the time.
Okay. And she was probably...
She was
already
48.
Oh,
Wow.
boy.
I am so ready for the story. I had to do my sexual harassment training yesterday for my job. So I am ready to be like, that's wrong.
No HR back then.
No HR.
So, it's true. Elizabeth Russell was no saint. By all accounts, she made sexual demands of Peter Eriksson. But eventually, we're going to be asking, okay, but does that make her a murderer? At this point, you still don't know who dies in the story.
No.
Have you wondered?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, here's your first clue. It's not Peter Eriksson.
Okay.
And we know it's not Peter because Peter testified at Elizabeth's trial.
Okay.
And a lot of what I'm going to tell you comes from his testimony.
Okay.
Two things, actually, his trial testimony and newspaper reports. But honestly, the newspaper reports were a lot of times just verbatim trial reports. That's how they reported the news, by literally reproducing the trial transcripts in the newspaper.
I would think he'd be biased as a witness.
Here's what Peter had to say about the, quote, improprieties between he and Elizabeth.
Oh.
This is from the local Eau Claire newspaper, which was called The Leader, MJ.
Oh, Fredonia.
From May 8th, 1892. There was a hush over the courtroom when Peter's name was called, and as Sheriff Fleming brought him up the center aisle. The first question was, when did you first see Mrs. Russell? And all present realized they were about to hear the story of two lives thrown closely together and whose intimacy, if any, would have a direct bearing upon the case. I think the newspaper people wrote that part.
Yeah.
The witness took his time to reply, and then quietly and somewhat of a slow dignity answered, in July 1889. Question, how old were you? Peter replied, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you had just asked how old was Peter, and according to his birth and death records, I'm pretty sure Peter was actually 22 years old in 1889, but Elizabeth Russell was 48.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter testified that he had been working in Porterville, which was also known as Porter's Mills, situated on the Chippewa River, which is about 4 miles south of Eau Claire. It was a logging boom town with a sawmill, and if you look it up today, you'll find it on the list of Wisconsin ghost towns.
Oh, wow.
Which sounds exotic, but really, it just means the town no longer exists.
Mm-hmm.
When the lumber ran out, the entire population of the town moved on, and by 1904, the town had ceased to be.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll hear a lot about our characters in our story going back and forth between Elizabeth's farm and Porterville. Anyway, Peter testified that he didn't like mill work in Porterville. He wanted to be a farmer. So he said, I was going by Mrs. Russell's, like he's literally just walking past her farm. And she was in the garden and called to me and asked me if I wanted a place on the farm. I said I did, and she offered me $20 a month if I would work all year round. So Peter was asked, where was Mr. Russell? And according to Peter, she said he was in the woods and wouldn't be home much.
Just out
In the woods.
Peter then testified that he occupied the bedroom off the kitchen in Elizabeth's house. Then he was asked, now, what was Mrs. Russell's manner towards you? Peter either did not understand the question or pretended he didn't understand because he did not reply. So the lawyer next said, now, Peter, you are under oath. Tell the whole truth. Relate all your associations with this woman, her manner to you, your relation to her, how they came about, whether they were familiar. Give a general history, and though it may be unpleasant, remember you owe a duty to the state. So Peter continued. He said, well, she used to be very friendly to me, and also kept noticing me very much. Now, remember, English was not Peter's first language. So the lawyer said, what do you mean by she kept noticing you? Peter said, she commenced telling me stories and laughing and talking with me when she had the chance. At first, the stories did not amount to anything, but then they were stories I have heard in camps and among the boys a good deal.
Oh.
A little racy.
I think that's what we're talking about. Then Peter said, she then commenced to lay her hands on my shoulders and later put her arms around my neck and also kiss me.
Mm.
Then she said she thought a good deal of me, and I looked the nearest like an old lover of hers. His name was Ed Cole, and she knew him in Horicon, Wisconsin.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Her true love.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about him in the last episode.
Right. And he unfortunately died in the war.
Peter said, she said her folks would not let her marry him, but she would have anyway, only he went away to the war and was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And she said she never cared for anyone after that except me. I was nearest like him than anyone else.
I guess the husband's just out in the woods. She doesn't really care.
That's what I thought. It's like, what does that say about Thomas Russell?
Oh, he was convenient.
I wish we knew how they came together in the first place.
I know.
Yeah, right.
Thomas and Elizabeth.
Interesting.
But apparently it was not love at first sight.
No.
So the lawyer went on to ask Peter if he ever went away from the house with Elizabeth, and Peter said, "Yes, sir, very often. We used to come uptown and go to the neighbors." And although Elizabeth also employed one or two girls at the house,
Oh.
Peter confirmed they never went along on the trips. It was always just Peter and Elizabeth alone.
Mm-hmm.
So one time they had to go look at a cow or something. I mean, they had business with neighboring farms and stuff.
Okay.
And they would be overnighters sometimes.
Oh, farm business. Overnight farm business.
Right.
Can you remind me what last episode we were talking about kind of prostitution? Was it implied that she was running like a ring of prostitutes? Like with these
brothel?
women that work at the house?
Oh, no, but thanks for saying that. No, I was not implying that Elizabeth was at all involved in prostitution.
Oh, I misunderstood.
We were talking about it mainly because of the lumbering industry and wondering whether Thomas engaged with prostitutes.
Oh,
because
okay.
it was so prevalent amongst the lumber workers.
okay.
No, I don't have any reason to believe that Elizabeth herself was involved in prostitution. The girls that worked at the house just did housework.
Oh, they did. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So back to the trips they took. Peter described one. On one trip, they stopped overnight at the farm of a couple named Asa in Pleasant Valley. Peter was asked about the, quote, improprieties that took place there. Now, earlier, Peter had refused to answer because adultery was a crime, and he was not willing to incriminate himself.
Yeah.
The court proceedings basically took a hard stop at that point, and we don't know exactly what happened, but they took a lengthy recess, and they must have worked it out somehow, because when they came back, everybody seemed to be satisfied, and Peter continued with his testimony. So he probably got some kind of immunity, because he was, sure enough, about to incriminate himself.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know it was illegal.
So when they came back, he was asked, "Where did these improprieties you swore to take place?" And Peter replied, "In the barn at the Asa's farm at about 7 o'clock on the evening of our arrival." So here's how the newspaper described what Peter said next. The witness answered questions saying the barn was 8 or 10 rods from the house.
And
What's
we
a
don't
rod?
remember
I knew you were going to
rod
say
is.
that. What's a rod?
What's a rod?
Oh.
Well, one rod is about 16 and a half feet. So let's see, the barn was 8 or 10 rods, so 10 rods would have been about 165 feet.
Okay.
The floor of the barn was dry. There was hay dust. The improprieties took place in the part of the barn where there were no stalls. According to Peter, Elizabeth said, "The folks," meaning the Asas who live there, "they're milking now, and now would be a good opportunity."
Yeah, straight to the point.
We always want to wait for the milking.
Yes.
The newspaper then says, "There followed a detailed conversation omitted from publication."
Oh.
So in other words, he described exactly what happened, but they weren't allowed to print it.
Yeah.
Oh, X-rated.
The newspaper did print some more questioning, though. So as to the activities in the barn, Peter was asked, "Did you object?" Peter, "No, sir." Lawyer, "Did you make any suggestion to go anywhere else?" Peter, "No, sir." Lawyer, "Why didn't you go upstairs?" Peter, "Downstairs was just as good."
Good answer.
Lawyer, "How did you know what Mrs. Russell meant by 'now was a good opportunity'?" Peter, "Why shouldn't I know?" The newspaper indicates that laughter from the courtroom ensued. Lawyer, "Describe your position, sitting, standing, or lying down." Peter, "We were lying down." Lawyer, "On what?" Peter, "On the ground, or whatever was there."
The hay dust.
The questioning then turned to life back at the Russell farm. Peter testified that acts of impropriety occurred about once a week.
Wow.
The newspaper said the witness testified the advances were always offensive to him and annoyed him. Acts of familiarity began, the witness said, a month or so after he first arrived at Mrs. Russell's. She continued telling him improper stories as long as he stayed there. He, Peter, had told Mrs. Russell that these attentions must stop, and at times was disgusted, and they were against his inclination. Peter was asked, "Can you remember how many times you objected to these acts?" He replied, "No, I can't." Lawyer, "Why were these acts offensive to you?" Peter, The reason was she was a married woman, or supposed to be. And another thing, I had never insulted anyone as long as I lived, nor didn't insult her. The record also shows elsewhere that Peter knew Thomas and regarded him pretty highly.
Oh, okay.
Lawyer, where did you usually meet? Peter, in my bedroom. Lawyer, at what time? Peter, at night. Lawyer, were arrangements made beforehand? Peter, no, sir. She would come in at all times of the night.
Oh, wow.
Lawyer, did the woman seem honestly to have an affection for you? Now, there was an objection to this question, which makes good sense, but Peter replied anyway. And he said, she said that she loved me. Then, according to the newspaper, the witness said when he told Mrs. Russell these acts should cease, she replied he was foolish and said it would never be found out.
Okay.
He must have hated working in the mill. It's like, why didn't he go back to the other job?
Yeah.
Well, we know he wanted to be a farmer. Maybe he was just trying to save up.
Oh, that's true.
I guess-
$20 a month, was that like the going rate?
It doesn't seem like a lot, but I guess if you had housing and food, you fed him too, right?
Yeah, but he had to grow it.
And then he got no sleep because she's coming in all the time.
It's interesting, though. I wonder if he just felt like people wouldn't believe him, or he didn't want to bring shame upon himself and her. It's like still some of the things that you hear people talk about now.
I think it's exactly like what you hear people talk about now.
Yeah. Right.
It's just not what we would have expected.
Right.
With it being the old woman and the young man.
Was his brother living in the house too?
Yes.
Didn't they both?
Yes.
Awkward.
His brother Adam also worked at the farm and also lived somewhere in the house. Now, where Adam slept, I don't know. And that to me is kind of a key issue.
Yeah.
But yes, Adam also worked there. Well, let's talk about one of the girls that worked there. Now, one of the girls that Elizabeth employed at the farm was a Swedish or Norwegian immigrant named Sarah Halverson. Let's pause for just a second to chat about Sweden and Norway. Peter's family, the Eriksons, were from Sweden.
Okay.
But throughout the whole record, there are references to him speaking Norwegian, or actually being a Norwegian. And this confused me. It puzzled me. And at first, I just chalked it up to Yankees not caring about precision, immigrant heritage. But it happened so many times that it just seemed to me that there just must have been some other factor. And I don't know whether this is the explanation or not, but I did learn that at the time we're talking about, Sweden and Norway were a united kingdom.
Oh.
So they had a common monarch, but separate governments, kind of like the British United Kingdom that we know today. So Sarah Halverson was, let's just say, a Norwegian immigrant who worked on Elizabeth Russell's farm. She was roughly the same age as Peter Erikson, and she spoke very little English. Peter spoke English quite well. Sarah almost not at all. But Peter and Sarah could speak their native language to one another, and did often. Now, what was Peter paid? $20 a month?
Right.
Okay, Sarah was employed by Elizabeth at a salary of $2 per week. So that's like $8 a month compared to Peter's $20.
Wow.
So here we go back to the opportunities for women.
Yeah.
You had asked this too. During the time, the people who regularly lived in the house were Elizabeth, Sarah, Peter, and Adam Erikson, Elizabeth's father, Lathrop Horton, and occasionally, but not very often, Thomas Russell.
Right. He's out in the woods.
Sarah slept in an upstairs bedroom, and so did Lathrop Horton. I'm assuming not the same upstairs bedroom, but they were both upstairs.
Okay.
Now remember, we just heard that Peter slept downstairs in a bedroom off the kitchen. And it seems that Elizabeth often slept on something they call a lounge in the dining room, which was on the same floor as the kitchen. So I'm not sure exactly what a lounge is, but the only thing I have in my mind is
chaise chairs or something.
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking.
So she was pretty close. There was a strict rule in the house, and that was Sarah was not to get up and come downstairs until Elizabeth called her in the morning.
Oh, wow.
Stay upstairs, Sarah.
Okay.
Now, we know that Elizabeth thought that Peter was kind of the reincarnation of her love from when she was young. What was his name again?
Edward Cole.
Right. And so we don't know if she had put any moves on Adam.
You know, I got the feeling from reading that at times she did put a move or two on Adam.
Did she let the dad come down this morning?
I don't know. Lathrop, upstairs. So Sarah can't come down until she gets called.
Right.
One morning, though, Sarah couldn't sleep and came downstairs at about 5:30 a.m., and she saw Elizabeth coming out of Peter's room. Elizabeth was dressed in a white nightgown and nothing else. Peter was in bed. When Elizabeth saw Sarah, she said, "Oh, you think you're very smart now, don't you?"
Wow.
Things were heating up.
Yeah.
Such that Elizabeth now started to become increasingly jealous of Peter paying any attention to other women.
Okay.
While Peter, for his part, seemed very much to enjoy paying attention to other women. And this brings us to two events: the Peeping Elmer incident and the Revolver Incident.
Oh, what'd you say it was? The peeping what?
Peeping Elmer. Like Peeping Tom, but it's Peeping Elmer.
And a revolver, you said?
And a revolver.
Yes. We'll start with the Peeping Elmer incident. Elmer Horton was Elizabeth's nephew.
Okay.
He was the son of Elizabeth's brother Oscar, and he occasionally came to work on Elizabeth's farm at harvest time. Elmer was 30 years old in 1890. In July of that year, he was at the Russell farm for a period of 3 or 4 weeks. So it's July. One night, Elmer's inside the house. Peter Erickson is sitting on the back porch, and on Peter's lap is Sarah Halverson.
Oh,
no.
Now, when this information came out at the trial, Peter was sitting right there in the courtroom. And according to the newspaper, Peter stroked his little mustache and laughed.
Oh, wow.
So who reported this?
Oh,
Who was on the stand when they said that?
Elmer.
It was Elmer.
Oh, okay.
Elmer is going to tell us what happened at the Peeping Elmer incident.
Right.
Okay.
Peter stroked his little mustache and laughed. Yes, what happened to Peter was wrong. He was the victim, certainly. On the other hand, I've got the feeling that he was maybe a little bit of a cad.
Right. So maybe he was kind of enjoying being a player.
We can only wonder. And
Wow.
if this was today and it was a woman we were talking about, that kind of comment would be totally inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I just made that comment, and it's totally inappropriate to say that because it's not relevant to what was happening to him.
Mm-hmm.
But you also want to know as much as you can about Peter, and that is an aspect of him. All right, so Elmer's in the house, Peter's on the porch, Sarah's on Peter's
Sarah's on the lap.
Right, okay. They asked Elmer, how was he sure that the person on Peter's lap was Sarah? And Elmer testified because it was in the moonlight. When asked where he was exactly to witness the situation, Elmer replied, "I was in the window of the dining room bedroom."
Dining room, bedroom.
Maybe he meant Peter's bedroom, which was off the kitchen. And apparently it had a window that looked out onto the back porch.
The porch. Okay.
Okay.
So, lawyer, what were you doing? Elmer, kneeling to see what I could see to satisfy my curiosity. There was then laughter in the courtroom. Lawyer, how long did you stay kneeling? Elmer, until they left. Lawyer, what effect did it have on you? Tremendous laughter in the courtroom, causing the judge to intercede and say to the lawyer, well, now what do you expect? Elmer did not report the incident to Elizabeth, but he didn't have to because, according to Elmer, she'd already seen and knew what was going on out there.
Okay.
All right. Second thing, the revolver incident. Peter testified that Elizabeth told him it made her feel bad when he noticed the hired girl, Sarah, more than Elizabeth. Peter was then asked, do you recollect any occasion when Mrs. Russell took a revolver and fired it outside the house? Peter said, yes.
Oh, wow.
And here's his testimony. Me and Adam were playing checkers, and Sarah Halverson was sitting by the table. It was, I think, our first and only game. Sarah was sitting nearest to me and took the checkers off the board and was fooling and wouldn't give them back to me. So I took hold of her hand and put the checkers back. Mrs. Russell was sitting, I think, in the dining room. She got up and went into my bedroom. Then she went out. I saw her with her hand under her apron with something. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that she had the revolver. At some point then, they heard shots. So Elizabeth has gone into his bedroom, gotten his revolver, kind of hidden it under her apron, gone outside, and then they hear shots. Peter continues. He said, Adam got up and went into my room and the revolver was gone. I pulled the curtain down on the kitchen window and told Sarah to go to bed. Then I heard Mrs. Russell come back. She went into her bedroom and we heard her moaning. She had her dress unbuttoned and I could see the end of a pillow slip she had taken off a pillow. She wouldn't answer when I asked if she was shot.
Oh, my.
I asked if we should send for the doctor. Mrs. Russell said the doctor couldn't help her. She also said not to send for Mr. Russell because I was going to see what was the matter, and I did.
You're saying
That's Peter talking.
Okay, boy.
So basically, at this point, we've got Elizabeth in the house now, moaning and not letting them know what's going on.
Right.
Okay.
So the lawyer said there was no blood on her bosom, and Peter said, "No, sir, there was no mark. I got a rag and put some lard on it and put it upon her chest. Then," this is still Peter talking, "then after I found she was not hurt, she seemed to get better, and Adam went off to bed, and I asked her what had made her do that. She said I was paying too much attention to Sarah. I told her I did not think I was. She said she wasn't going to keep her any longer, that she'd either do her own work or get another girl. Sarah was out."
Right. Sarah, oh, wow.
The lawyer then said, "Now, did you have improper intercourse with Mrs. Russell at that time?" And Peter's reply was, "I declined to answer."
Oh, wow.
That's interesting.
So we've set the stage. What do you think so far?
What was the lard on the bosom about?
I didn't really understand that either.
I mean, was she okay, so she shoots the gun, but she's not shot herself.
She did not shoot herself. She was just
kind
out
of
there.
expressing her anger.
Yeah. And in fact, I read at one point during a different proceeding, Elizabeth herself was asked about this incident. "Do you remember taking a revolver and going outside and shooting it?" And she said yes. And she was asked, "Why did you do that?" And her answer was, "For my own amusement."
Oh, wow.
But it was not her gun, it was his gun?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh. Did she kill anyone accidentally by shooting this revolver? Where's Lathrop? Did he get shot?
That's a good question.
Interesting that Peter just declined to answer because he's said so much about what happened in the past.
Right. But on this occasion, he wouldn't answer.
It's interesting they allowed him to say that. Intrigued.
Yeah.
It's also weird that Adam's like, "I'm going to bed. You're all right." You've got a gun, but you've got lard on your bosom. Going to bed.
Everything is okay.
All right, well, the next thing that happens in our story is going to be a dance. The Erickson family, that's Peter and Adam's folks,
Right.
hosted a dance at their farm, either in December 1890 or January 1891, or the beginning of the new year.
Okay.
That dance changed everything and set a bunch of lives on the path to tragedy.
Oh, wow.
Ooh.
Now, it doesn't sound like a great time to have a barn dance.
Was
like middle of the winter?
It was either like Christmas or New Year's.
Yeah, I guess you have to celebrate the holidays still, right?
Yeah. All right. Or maybe they're just always drunk and they don't feel the weather.
We did talk about that aspect.
And the dance is going to be pivotal. If the dance didn't happen, the story would not have happened.
Okay.
Ooh.
Right. So it sounds like there's some upcoming jealousy.
Yeah. Wonder if
Could
Thomas
be.
comes back for the dance.
Oh, could be.
Doppelnamers is a production of Harriet's Guides, LLC. Our theme music was composed and performed by Mary Jean Stead, orchestrated and arranged by Janine Lynn Claps. The Doppelnamers logo was designed by Kay Lum. Thanks to my co-hosts, Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Thanks to the Wisconsin State Law Library, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the archivists at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Take care, Doppelnamers.